Billionaire hires a nurse for his sick son, installs cameras, and discovers something shocking. That morning, Billionaire CEO Richard Cole was worried about the health of his only son. The boy's condition had worsened over the past few weeks, and despite having access to the best medical minds money could buy, nothing seemed to work. The mansion, though massive and designed to impress, felt heavy with silence. Too quiet. Too lifeless. Richard Cole had built empires, broken records, and sat atop global wealth rankings. But all the success in the world meant nothing when your 8-year-old son was wasting away before your eyes. At exactly 8 a.m., his assistant, Martha, knocked on the office door and entered. "The nurse is here, sir." Richard didn't look up from the screen showing his latest business portfolio. "Bring her in." Moments later, Emma walked into the room. She was 24, young but confident. Her uniform was simple, her posture respectful but not submissive. Her eyes held something that surprised Richard, calm empathy. Not pity, not awe, just a quiet strength. His 8-year-old son, Leo, had a rare immune disorder and hadn't smiled in months. Leo's condition required round-the-clock monitoring, specialized care, and emotional support that most medical professionals simply couldn't sustain. Emma had applied through a private network that catered only to the elite, and her resume had instantly stood out. But still, Richard was skeptical. He gestured for her to sit. "Emma Bennett," he said, his voice clipped. "You come highly recommended. Ivy League degree, pediatric experience, fluency in French and sign language, CPR certified. Why would someone like you want this job?" Emma smiled softly. "Because Leo deserves more than just a nurse. He needs someone who sees him. Not just the diagnosis." Richard's brow twitched. "You think you can handle this place? You'll be living on-site, under pressure, with no real time off. We don't run things like a hospital here." "I'm not here for comfort," she replied calmly. "I'm here for Leo." Her voice didn't waver. That intrigued him. He leaned back, folding his arms. "Tell me about a time you failed." Emma didn't hesitate. "I got too emotionally attached to a patient once. A 5-year-old girl with late-stage leukemia. I thought I could save her with sheer will. I couldn't, but I held her hand until the end. Her parents said that mattered more than anything." Silence lingered between them. Richard didn't show it, but something about that story hit a nerve. His wife had passed away 4 years ago, and he hadn't held her hand when she died. He had been on a plane sealing a merger. His son had lost his mother. Richard had lost himself. He cleared his throat. "You start tomorrow." Emma gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Cole." As she turned and walked out of the office, Richard watched her with a narrowed gaze. Once the door closed behind her, he pressed a button on his desk intercom. "Martha," he said, "have security install cameras in every room she'll be using. I want full surveillance. Especially Leo's room." "Yes, sir," came the reply. Emma's first few days in the mansion unfolded like a quiet ballet, each step deliberate, each action measured with care. She rose before sunrise, moving silently through the vast hallways with a grace that felt almost too soft for a house built of steel, marble, and silence. Despite the wealth around her, grand staircases, priceless art, and chandeliers heavy with diamonds, the atmosphere felt sterile, like a place where time had stopped the day happiness died. Emma knew that feeling well. She carried her own shadows, though she wore them lightly. Leo's room was tucked away in the east wing, sunlit but cold in spirit. The boy she found curled in the hospital-style bed on that first morning was a ghost of childhood. Pale, thin, and wrapped in layers of blankets despite the warmth, Leo stared at the ceiling with empty eyes. He didn't turn to look at her when she entered. He didn't blink when she greeted him. He didn't respond when she spoke his name softly and introduced herself. But Emma didn't expect miracles. She set down her bag gently and moved around the room with unhurried ease, like a breeze entering an abandoned space. She adjusted the blinds to let the morning sun filter in softly. She fluffed his pillows without asking. She spoke gently as she worked, describing each step, not because she thought he would answer, but because she believed he deserved the respect of being addressed. "Leo, I'm going to read you something today. Just a few pages. If you don't like it, blink twice and I'll stop," she said with a smile. There was no blink, but also no resistance. So she began. A worn book of fairy tales sat on the bedside shelf, clearly untouched for a long time. Emma picked it up, opened it to the first page, and started reading in a quiet, soothing tone. Her voice didn't dramatize the characters. She read simply, as if speaking to a friend, and after 20 minutes, she closed the book and sat beside him in silence. Leo didn't react, but Emma saw it. The faintest movement of his eyes, the twitch of his fingers, the smallest sign that he heard her. Elsewhere in the mansion, Richard Cole watched everything unfold on the screen in his office. It had become part of his nightly ritual. Pour a glass of expensive bourbon, sit at the oversized desk, and study the surveillance feed like it was a stock chart. He didn't know what he expected to find. A mistake? A moment of selfishness? A lie? But all he saw was patience. Care. A kind of presence that couldn't be faked. Emma never touched her phone while in Leo's room. Never lost her temper. Never crossed any lines. She moved through his world like someone who belonged there. Richard frowned, swirling the bourbon. He didn't like how quickly Leo seemed to soften around her. The boy didn't smile, not yet, but his eyes lingered on Emma longer than they had with anyone in months. When she brought in a small music box and played a gentle tune, Leo's hand moved slightly in rhythm. When she hummed along, his expression flickered, not joy, exactly, but something close. By the third day, Emma had memorized Leo's medication schedule, his preferences for food textures, and his nonverbal cues, when a tilt of his head meant discomfort, when a flutter of his fingers meant anxiety. She learned that he preferred warm washcloths to cold ones, and that he liked the scent of lavender more than citrus. None of this came from the medical files. She learned because she watched, listened, and respected the silence he lived in. In the evenings, after his treatments, she would dim the lights and tell him stories, some from books, others made up on the spot. They were stories about brave foxes and quiet wolves, about lonely trees and laughing stars. Sometimes she made them funny, and once, just once, Leo let out a small laugh, a breathy sound, so faint it could have been imagined. But it wasn't. Richard heard it. He had been watching the monitor, half distracted, when the sound made him lean forward. He replayed the clip again and again. The boy had laughed. Only once since his mother died had Leo shown a real sign of joy, and now, because of this stranger with a soft voice and tired eyes, it had happened again. It disturbed Richard more than it comforted him. He built high walls to keep people out. No one got close to Leo. No one got close to him. And yet, here was Emma, cracking open something delicate. She wasn't trying to win favors or earn praise. She wasn't performing. She was just being there. And somehow, that was worse, because it meant she wasn't pretending. On the fourth night, Emma stayed by Leo's bed longer than usual. He had a minor fever and wasn't sleeping well. She sat beside him, holding his hand in both of hers, humming a lullaby that Richard recognized but didn't want to admit he remembered. The same one his wife used to hum when Leo was just a toddler, afraid of thunderstorms. Richard clenched his jaw, staring at the screen. Something in him twisted, uncertain and unsettled. He didn't know what Emma's intentions were. He didn't believe in people. Not anymore. But Leo was responding, and that scared him. Not because he thought Emma would hurt his son, but because for the first time in a long time, he feared what would happen if she left. The mansion was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that seeps into your skin and makes the air feel heavier. It was past midnight, and the staff had long retired to their quarters. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the tall windows, casting shimmering patterns on the marble floor. But Richard Cole was wide awake, his eyes locked on the glowing screens that lined the wall of his private study. He sat at his massive oak desk, one hand resting on a half-empty glass of bourbon, the other flicking through hours of silent footage. The room was dark except for the pale light of the monitors, casting hard lines across his face. It had become a habit, watching Emma, not out of simple distrust anymore, but something more complicated, something he couldn't quite name. She intrigued him, unsettled him. She didn't act like the others. No performance, no mask, no angle, or at least none that he could see. That in itself was suspicious. He fast-forwarded through footage from earlier that evening. Most of it was routine. Emma administering Leo's medication, adjusting his blankets, reading softly. She always read after dinner, choosing fairy tales, poems, or little stories she seemed to make up on the spot. But tonight, something was different. Richard paused when he saw the timestamp flick past 11:30 p.m. Emma hadn't left the room. Curious, he rewound and hit play again. The camera in Leo's room showed a soft, warm glow from the bedside lamp. Emma was seated on the edge of the bed, her posture slightly slouched, as if fatigue had finally caught up with her. Leo was fast asleep, his tiny form curled under the blanket like a leaf tucked in for winter. And Emma. She sat there gently stroking his hair, a motion so natural, so maternal, it made Richard blink. Then she began to hum. The tune was quiet, almost inaudible through the surveillance feed, but Richard knew it instantly. His spine stiffened, and his hand froze over the mouse. It was the lullaby. Not just any lullaby. Her lullaby. The one Julia, Leo's mother, used to sing when the boy couldn't sleep. The one she had hummed on stormy nights, in hospital rooms, on long car rides to keep Leo calm. The melody was simple and haunting, soft enough to soothe, strong enough to linger. Richard hadn't heard it since the funeral. He had buried the sound with her, locked it away in the quiet corners of memory he never dared to visit. Yet here it was, coming from Emma's lips like a ghost stepping out of time. He leaned in, heart pounding, breath caught in his throat. The screen flickered slightly, the image grainy, but it didn't matter. He saw her, saw how her eyes were tired but tender, how her hand moved through Leo's hair like she had done it 1,000 times before. And then she whispered, "You look just like her." Richard's blood ran cold. There was no one else in the room. No reason for her to speak those words, unless she believed Leo couldn't hear her, or unless she believed no one else would. But the camera saw everything, and Richard saw it all. He grabbed the mouse, scrolled back, and watched again. The same lullaby, the same whisper. "You look just like her." The glass of bourbon sat forgotten as Richard stood up, heart racing. His mind spun in 1,000 directions. Who was she talking about? Julia? How would Emma know what Julia looked like? They had never met. Emma had come from an agency, clean records, strong references, a glowing history in pediatric care. No red flags. At least, not at first glance. But now, that didn't sit right. He sat back down slowly, eyes still locked on the screen. Emma stayed there another 10 minutes, eventually slipping out of the room quietly, her expression unreadable. But Richard wasn't thinking about Emma anymore. He was thinking about the lullaby, about the whisper, about the eerie familiarity she seemed to show, as if she knew more than she should. The next morning, he called his head of security. "I want a background check on Emma Hill," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "We already did one before hiring." "Do it again," Richard snapped. "And this time, I don't want the agency's version. I want everything. Every city she's lived in, every name she's used, every school, hospital, friend, ex, coworker, all of it. I want to know who she is, who she was, and who she's been pretending to be. No limits. No questions." The security chief didn't argue. One didn't argue with Richard Cole when his voice took on that tone. Richard ended the call and sat back, staring at the footage once more. His thoughts twisted into knots. Was it a coincidence? A mother's lullaby wasn't a secret. It could have been something Emma heard from Leo himself, or read in his old medical files. But that lullaby? That whisper? "You look just like her." It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like recognition. And recognition meant connection. But what kind? Emma was kind to Leo. That much was true. And Leo had begun to trust her, respond to her, even laugh with her. Richard had seen the change. The light returning to his son's eyes, the way his shoulders loosened when Emma walked into the room. Richard should have felt relief. Instead, he felt watched. Not by Emma, but by something bigger. By fate, or past sins, or a truth long buried clawing its way back to the surface. He poured himself another drink but didn't touch it. His eyes never left the screen. Emma's face froze in the frame, soft, glowing, still humming a lullaby that shouldn't have belonged to her. Who was she? Richard sat alone in his study, the walls around him towering and cold, a fortress built as much to keep others out as to guard his own secrets. The soft hum of the city below was muffled by the thick glass windows, yet the silence inside pressed down heavier than any noise. Tonight, he was waiting for answers, the kind that didn't come wrapped in corporate reports or polished lies. Tonight, he expected the truth. His private investigator had been working quietly, tracing Emma's past with a meticulous patience Richard rarely admired. The man was finally due with the report, and Richard's hand trembled slightly as he answered the call. The voice on the other end was steady, professional, but what it delivered would unravel everything Richard thought he knew. "Emma Hill isn't who she says she is," the investigator reported. "Her real name is Emily Bennett. She was adopted as a child and has no known family." No siblings, no close relatives. Richard's mind reeled. He thought he had hired a nurse, a caretaker, a stranger. But what was revealed felt like a crack in the foundation of his carefully controlled world. More than that, the investigator continued. We ran a DNA cross-check, a precaution you requested. You asked for thorough. Richard's heart pounded louder, each beat like a hammer striking steel. There's a match. A maternal bloodline connection to your late wife, Julia. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the air itself held its breath. Richard felt the weight of those words sink deep. Emily Bennett was family, his family. She was Leo's aunt. He hadn't expected this. Not this tangled, raw revelation. The man on the phone added quietly, it's rare, but not impossible. Your wife's family line and Emily's biological mother share the same lineage. You asked for full disclosure. You have it. Richard ended the call, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The world shifted beneath him. He needed to see Emily. He needed to hear it from her. Later that afternoon, he found her in Leo's room, sitting quietly on the floor, reading a worn book. The light caught the strands of her hair, making them glow. She looked up as he entered, surprise flickering in her eyes, quickly masked by a calm that felt brittle. Emma, Richard began, his voice steady but low. Or should I say, Emily. He laid the printouts of the report on the bedside table, the words and DNA charts staring back like accusations. She studied the papers for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The tears came quickly, unbidden, soft drops tracing down her cheeks. I didn't want you to find out like this, she said, voice trembling. I only found out about my biological family a few months ago. It was a shock. I wasn't sure what to do. Richard watched her carefully, seeing the layers beneath the surface. The fear, the confusion, the hope. I took this job because I wanted to be close to Leo, she continued. Not to deceive you, but to protect him. To be there for him, as family should be. Her confession hung in the air between them. It was fragile but real. Richard's mind raced. Years of grief and loss, walls built to keep everyone out, and now this unexpected presence, a woman who belonged to the past and the future all at once. He saw the way Leo looked at her, the way the boy's eyes lit up when she was near. Emily, was not just a nurse. She was family, blood of Julia's blood, and the living thread connecting the fragments of his shattered life. The revelation was a shock, yes, but beneath it was something else, an unspoken chance for healing, for connection, for hope. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt the tight grip of control loosen just enough to let something new in. And maybe, just maybe, that something was exactly what they all needed. The mansion felt colder now, as if the walls themselves absorbed the tension that filled the air. Richard Cole, a man who had built his life on control and precision, was unraveling. The revelation about Emily Bennett, the woman who was more than a nurse, who was blood to his late wife, had shaken him to his core. But instead of opening up, he retreated further into himself, barricading his emotions behind a wall thicker than any security system he had ever installed. He didn't fire Emma. That much was clear. But he stopped speaking to her altogether. The words between them dried up, leaving behind a heavy silence that settled like dust over every room she entered. Emma moved through the mansion with the same quiet grace, but without the warmth that once flowed freely between her and Richard. His glances were cold, sharp, cutting through the fragile space she tried to maintain. He didn't trust her yet. Maybe he never would. Leo noticed immediately. The little boy, who had begun to show signs of life under Emma's care, now pulled back into himself. The pale smile that had started to creep onto his lips vanished entirely. His eyes, once flickering with the faintest glimmer of hope, now clouded over with confusion and fear. The fragile bond that Emma had worked so hard to build was cracking under Richard's unspoken disapproval. Even the servants whispered behind closed doors about the palpable chill that had settled in the house. The mansion, once a place of careful routine and hushed hope, now felt like a prison of silence and suspicion. Then came the night that shattered the fragile facade entirely. Leo's medical condition was unpredictable, a constant shadow looming over every breath he took. That night, the boy's breathing grew shallow and erratic, a dangerous dance on the edge of crisis. Emma, ever vigilant, noticed immediately. She was by his side in an instant, checking his vitals, adjusting his oxygen, her hands steady despite the urgency. Richard was in his study when the alert came. The piercing sound of the medical monitor cut through the silence like a scream. He dropped his glass and sprinted down the corridor, adrenaline surging through his veins. He arrived at Leo's room just as Emma administered a precise injection. Her face was calm but fierce, every movement a testament to years of training and care. Leo's chest rose and fell more evenly now, the color returning to his cheeks. Richard watched, breath caught in his throat, as Leo's tiny hand found Emma's. The boy clung to her with a desperation that broke through the cold shell Richard had wrapped himself in. Leo's voice was barely a whisper, but the words struck Richard like a thunderclap. "Please don't leave." Emma looked up at Richard, her eyes shining with unshed tears and quiet strength. That single moment dissolved months of mistrust and silence. Richard realized then that Emma was not just a nurse or a stranger. She had become essential, not only to Leo's fragile recovery, but to his very heart. That night, as the house finally settled into quiet stillness, something inside Richard began to shift. He stood by the doorway longer than usual, watching Emma beside Leo's bed. Her presence no longer seemed foreign or suspicious. It was natural, fitting, as if she had always belonged there. The shadows cast by the soft lamp wrapped around her gently, and in her calm, he found something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Richard returned to his study, not to pore over documents or surveillance, but to think. For years, the study had served as a place of control, a room from where he monitored, calculated, and kept the world at arm's length. But tonight, for the first time, he saw it for what it really was: a tomb of memories. His wife's laughter had never touched these walls. His son's joy had never echoed in this room. It had been a sanctuary of fear, of loneliness. He looked around at the dark monitors. Lifeless screens stared back at him, once pulsing with constant video feeds of Emma's every move. Now blank, they seemed obsolete. He rose and opened the cabinet where the surveillance equipment sat. One by one, he unplugged every cord, every camera feed, every false sense of safety. He could no longer live behind images on a screen. The next morning, Richard did something unusual. He woke early, walked into the kitchen, and made 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one for Emma. When she came downstairs, surprised to see him there, he offered her a seat. She hesitated, but took it. "I didn't sleep much," Richard admitted. Emma nodded, cradling the mug with both hands. "Neither did I." He looked at her, and for once, there was no wall between them. No suspicion, only understanding. "Do you remember," he asked softly, "the first time you sat with him during a fever? It was late. You were humming to him. I watched that moment 10 times over." Emma smiled sadly. "I knew. I always had a sense someone was watching. I just hoped that if you saw what I saw in Leo, you'd start to trust again." Richard's throat tightened. "I didn't know how. After Julia died, it felt like everyone wanted something from us. The money, the name, the access. No one ever really wanted to see him. Not the real him." "I did," Emma said gently. "From the first moment. Not because he's your son, but because he's my family, too. I would have loved him either way, but now that I know the truth, I'll never leave him." Richard's eyes burned. The honesty in her voice, the conviction, cut through years of doubt and pain. "You remind me of her," he said suddenly. Emma blinked. "Julia? She used to sit with Leo when he couldn't sleep," he said, voice low, nearly lost in memory. "She'd stroke his hair, hum that same lullaby. I remember thinking once, how can a single song carry so much love?" Emma's voice trembled. "I only ever heard it once. In an old video I found by accident. I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't." His words came quickly, firm. "You brought her back, even for just a moment. And more than that, you brought him back." There was a long pause. Then Richard added, "And maybe you brought me back too." That day marked a turning point. Richard told the staff that Emma was no longer a nurse under contract but a part of the family. He didn't offer a formal announcement. He didn't have to. The house began to feel different, warmer. The staff, once tight-lipped and somber, smiled a little more. The rooms, once echoing with emptiness, were filled with soft voices and laughter. Emma's presence had changed the rhythm of the mansion, and now everyone adjusted to the new harmony. Days passed, then weeks. Emma and Richard began spending more time together, not out of obligation, but connection. They took walks with Leo through the garden. Emma encouraged Richard to talk about Julia, and for the first time in years, he did, openly, without breaking down. They shared quiet meals, stories, moments of comfortable silence. One afternoon, as autumn leaves drifted across the long driveway, Richard found Emma sitting in the conservatory, reading aloud to Leo. The boy's head rested against her arm, his eyes half closed in contentment. Richard stood quietly at the entrance, watching. Later that night, Richard approached her in the hallway. "Would you join us for dinner?" he asked. Emma looked up, surprised. "Us? Me and Leo," he clarified, then added, "It's time he sees what family looks like around a table." The meal was simple: grilled fish, roasted vegetables, and a slice of apple pie that made Leo grin. They laughed, remembered Julia, and created a new memory that belonged only to the three of them. Eventually, the house became something else. Not just a place where pain was hidden and monitored, but a living, breathing home. Richard took down all the remaining cameras. Some were hardwired into the structure, installed so long ago he'd almost forgotten they existed. He ripped them out himself, sweating in the attic and behind paneling. When Emma tried to help, he laughed and handed her a screwdriver. "If I'm going to stop hiding, I have to do it all the way," he told her. The final camera came down from Leo's room. As it dropped into Richard's hand, he looked around at the space. Leo was asleep in bed, Emma curled beside him in a reading chair. The boy's chest rose and fell peacefully, no longer haunted by fear. The silence was no longer hollow. It was sacred. Richard left the room, but before he shut the door, he looked back one last time. No lens, no footage, just life. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard Cole smiled without guilt, without the need to monitor, protect, or calculate. He smiled like a man who had lost everything and, somehow, found more than he thought was possible. He smiled like a father. Spring had arrived like a quiet miracle, softening the chill that once lived in the mansion's stone walls. Light filtered in through the tall windows, casting long golden shadows across the polished floors. Where silence had once ruled, there was now a gentle rhythm. Footsteps, laughter, the occasional burst of Leo's delighted squeal as he chased a soccer ball across the garden. The house had changed, but so had the people in it. Emma stood in the sunlit kitchen, arranging fruit on a tray. Her hair was tied loosely, a few strands escaping around her face, and a soft hum escaped her lips. Behind her, the once silent halls buzzed with life, Leo's voice, high and cheerful, as he called to Richard from the garden. She paused for a moment, watching from the kitchen window as father and son kicked a ball back and forth on the grass. Leo's movements were still cautious, but each step was bolder than the last. His immune condition was far from gone, but therapy, medication, and, most of all, emotional stability had done what medicine alone couldn't. It had helped him thrive. Emma carried the tray outside. The garden had been transformed. What was once a cold stretch of manicured perfection now bloomed with color. Sunflowers leaned toward the sky, daisies framed the paths, and a small wooden bench sat under a blooming cherry tree, hand-painted by Emma and Leo during one of their weekend craft projects. A table was set under the tree, covered in a white cloth and topped with simple plates, lemonade, sandwiches, and a strawberry tart Leo had helped decorate. "Looks amazing," Richard said, brushing grass from his knees as he approached. "You really know how to make this place feel like home." Emma smiled, placing the tray down. "It's easier when the people inside it feel like home, too." Richard looked at her for a moment. There was something in his eyes, gratitude, warmth, and a gentleness that had once seemed impossible for a man who'd lived in walls of steel and surveillance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It was folded at the corners, the colors faded with time. Julia, his late wife, smiled back from the image, her eyes bright, her arm wrapped around a young woman they once hadn't known existed. Emma took the photo, her breath catching in her chest. It was the only picture they had found of her biological sister, her birth sister. She had grown up never knowing Julia existed. It wasn't until the DNA test and private investigation, after Richard's discovery, that Emma had finally seen this photo. She stared at it now, overwhelmed by the strange ache of closeness and distance. She walked over to Leo's chair, propped the photo on the table beside his plate, and smiled. "She would have been proud," she said quietly. Richard stood beside her. "She would have loved you." Leo, seated between them, looked at the photo, then at Emma. "Is that Mommy?" Emma knelt beside him, brushing a hand through his hair. "Yes, sweetheart. That was your mommy. My sister." Leo tilted his head. "That means you're like, my second mommy?" She laughed softly, tears shining in her eyes. "Something like that." Richard sat down, and for a moment, the three of them simply sat together, bathed in the warm hush of the afternoon. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sweet scent of blooming flowers filled the air. It wasn't a grand celebration. There were no guests or gifts or fireworks. It was quiet, intimate. Just the three of them, a small garden, a photo of the past, and the promise of something new. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, casting everything in honey-colored light, Emma and Richard cleared the table while Leo drew chalk animals on the stone path nearby. Richard wiped his hands on a towel and glanced at her. "You know," he said, "when I first hired you, I thought I was bringing in a temporary caretaker. Someone to follow rules, keep a schedule, give medicine, and then leave." Emma raised an eyebrow, teasing. "Charming." He chuckled. "I was wrong. You didn't just care for him. You healed him. And in the process, you healed something in me, too." She looked at him, soft and serious. "You let me. That was the difference." There was a pause before he spoke again, this time quieter. "You showed me that family doesn't always arrive the way we expect. Sometimes, it walks in under a false name, carrying wounds we can't see, and gives everything even if it's afraid." She blinked quickly to keep the tears at bay. "I was terrified when I came here. But Leo, he gave me courage. And you, well, you gave me a place to stay." The moment stretched between them, charged with the kind of unspoken understanding that only time and shared pain could build. Then, Richard reached out and gently took her hand. "Stay," he said. "Not just in this house. Stay in our lives." Emma's voice cracked. "I wasn't planning on going anywhere." That night, the house was quiet again, but not the cold, tense quiet it had once known. It was the kind of peaceful hush that follows a long day of joy. Emma tucked Leo into bed, and he clung to her hand a moment longer than usual. "Can we do this again tomorrow?" he asked sleepily. "The garden party?" He nodded. "Of course," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Every day, if you want." As she turned out the light, she found Richard standing in the hallway. He hadn't been watching from a monitor. He hadn't been hiding behind technology. He had simply come to say goodnight. "Want to sit outside a bit longer?" he asked. They returned to the bench under the cherry tree. The stars were beginning to emerge, one by one, dotting the velvet sky. A soft wind rustled the branches above them, petals falling like blessings around their feet. "You know," Richard said, "for a long time, I thought love was something you either earned or lost. That once it was gone, it couldn't come back. But sitting here with you, with Leo asleep upstairs, I think maybe love just changes. Maybe it comes back in different forms." Emma leaned her head on his shoulder. "Or maybe it never leaves at all. Maybe we just forget how to recognize it." They stayed like that for a long while, no need for more words, no fears of what came next. This wasn't the family Richard had envisioned when he first built the mansion, when he had imagined fatherhood, when he had held his son for the first time next to Julia's hospital bed. This wasn't the story he had written in his mind. It was messier, more painful, and infinitely more beautiful. This was a new beginning, not forged by plans or wealth or blood alone, but by truth, forgiveness, and the quiet power of second chances. In the days that followed, they planted a small memorial tree for Julia near the garden, something alive, something growing. They decorated it with wind chimes and tiny painted stones. Leo added a drawing of his mother, taped lovingly to the trunk. And every evening, as the sun set, they returned to the garden, to eat, to laugh, to remember, to live. Because families aren't always born. Sometimes they are found slowly, painfully, beautifully. And once found, they are never lost again. If you enjoyed this emotional journey featuring Richard, Emma, and young Leo, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and most importantly, share it with someone who loves a good story. We'd really love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about how things ended between Richard and Emma? Did you expect Leo to bond with Emma the way he did? Drop a comment below and tell us how this story made you feel. Also, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Be honest. We appreciate every bit of feedback. And don't forget to let us know where you're watching from in the comments. It means a lot seeing how far these stories travel. Thanks again for being here. We'll see you in the next one.